I am not an advocate. Why do I say that sentence? Because my role, I believe, is distinct from advocates. And let me explain this to you because I feel quite strongly about it, and I think it's your right as a parent or a therapist or a teacher to understand more deeply and in a more nuanced way who I am and what my approach is and where I believe I can support people. Okay, hi everyone, welcome. So I'm going to talk about 5 things about my approach as an invitation to understand what I'm doing here with you guys. And so you can determine fit. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that I don't identify as an advocate. And I want to tell you guys a story about this as it relates to my role and who I am. Okay, so before my son reached burnout, I actually worked for a very large nonprofit, well-known nonprofit in Washington, D.C., who did a lot of policy and advocacy work. However, it was premised on research. And my role within the organization was to help lead a team of methodologists, data scientists, coders, all of the things that you need to do to ensure research integrity, and to support the policy teams and the advocates in ensuring that their research was evidence-based, unbiased, like the facts were correct and the data could be replicated. Okay, so my role was to work with advocates and challenge them, right? To slow them down, to replicate data, to fact check, to ask them pointed questions, right? So for example, and this can be triggering sometimes. So for example, there's a environmental conservation team and they're studying and then advocating on the impact of creating a conserved space in marine areas, right? And so they're coming to my team and saying, we want to do research to prove that if we create this marine conservation area, it will result in Y. And my role was to say, actually, that's not research if you already know the outcome. And so what we need to do is develop a research question that we can examine with data, test hypotheses, and draw conclusions that are unbiased. And sometimes the response to me and my team would be, don't you care about environmental conservation? Of course I do, but that's not my role. My role is not to go onto the Hill in Washington, D.C. and advocate for environmental conservation. My role was to ensure that the research with which they were advocating was unbiased and sound so that they could advocate effectively. Okay, so what does this have to do with PDA? What does this have to do with what we're doing here? I believe that my contribution is much more as a researcher and an advocate than an advocate in the PDA space. What does that mean? I'm here to look at patterns, understand distributions, not just in children, but also in you, in order to move the needle forward so that you can find peace as a family. I sincerely believe that every time a family with all of you amazing people actually reaches stability, it opens up space for you parents to do the amazing things on this earth that you're meant to do, right? Like I've had many families I've worked with who have gone on to think about starting a school, starting a nonprofit, all of these things in the PDA space or in other areas like environmental conservation or social justice or whatever it is, right? So I believe that the contribution I can make to shifting things is not through direct advocacy, but rather through understanding without bias PDA and parents who are raising PDA children in order to help them stabilize and receive peace in their families. Okay, so the second thing that relates back to this is I don't have a strong or fixed identity around a neurotype. That's just not me, okay? So I've explored this for a long time of I used to think I was very neurotypical after a lot of trauma work and therapy and EMDR and SSP and somatics. I'm like, well, maybe I am neurodivergent. I certainly have hyperfixations. I have special interests. We're doing it now. I've been diagnosed with OCD, severe anxiety. I'm on all the meds. I have sensory stuff. However, I don't identify as a particular neurotype. It's not who I am, right? But I think because I have that non-attachment to advocating for a particular neurotype, I can play a particularly reflective role with you as a parent as you necessarily explore your own identity and support your child in autonomously moving towards their identity. Because some PDA kids are going to end up having a very strong identity around autism or PDA or ADHD. Others are like kids whose parents I've worked with are going to say, I'm just John. Like, I don't want a neurotype identity. And all of this is premised on the idea of equality and autonomy, right? Of like, there is no one way to do this, and there is no one way that your child will eventually identify. What's important is that they have a healthy self-concept and that they understand themselves. Okay? The third thing I want you guys to know is that I'm completely open to being wrong, right? And that has to do with my academic training of like always approaching things with a curiosity mindset. And let me give you an example. When I first started this journey, I completely made a huge 180 away from what I call the exposure paradigm. Okay? Exposure meaning the way that we treat anxiety in order to move us through a sticky brain, right? So like a lot of times we identify PDA kids as highly anxious, and so we approach them with exposure to the things that they're afraid of, to the things that they're avoiding. And for many PDA kids, depending on where they are in their burnout equilibrium cycle, this can actually produce a trauma response instead of moving them through sticky cognitive loops or rumination, and can make the avoidance worse. And so my swing was from like, exposure is okay because I've done it in my own therapies and it's worked for me to overcome a lot of anxiety, all the way to like exposure never works for PDA kids. What does this have to do with being open to being wrong? As I've worked with hundreds of families and as my son has moved through burnout and to a more equilibrium space, and I've watched my husband have a different role with my son, I've learned that sequentially there may be a space for some exposure, right? Okay, so like through the last 4 years, the openness to being wrong, which takes like putting my ego on the back burner, means that things may shift as we learn more, which is the foundation of any research or building a body of knowledge, right? If we don't have that curiosity mindset and openness to learning and evolving, then we're getting stuck in the like, this is how it is, and we're not open to expanding the body of knowledge on what we're trying to learn here. Okay? Number 4, I will never prescribe an action as like a right or wrong thing to do. My role here is to provide you guys invitations, offerings, and encouragement to experiment. So I feel very strongly about this, because if I were to prescribe actions as right and wrong, of like, you can never have screen time limits, or you have to lower all demands, or you shouldn't do X, Y, and Z therapy, then what am I doing? I'm replicating exactly the same paradigm of right and wrong and dogma that is pervasive in the behavioral space and that many of us have experienced as parents, of like, you need to double down on this approach, and if it's not working for your child or you as a parent, then actually you're doing it wrong. Instead of looking at it as, let's experiment, let's collect data on ourselves and our children, let's be objective, and then let's tune in to the data in front of us and make decisions. And they might look different than another parent in the PDA space, or how another parent's doing it, and that's totally fine. So let me give you a concrete example of this. So one of the 12 accommodations I teach is humor as a de-escalation technique. for many parents, when they experiment with this, it brings up trauma or a fawn response if they're trying to do self-deprecating humor with their kid, right? Where the child, swears at them and they try and diffuse it through humor, but then they experience like a PTSD response from fawning in their childhood. I'm not going to tell them, double down on humor, you're doing it wrong, right? We're going to tune into that data within our own bodies and make different decisions and get creative within the constraints. The same is true for observations of our children. Let me give you another example. We have the 12 accommodations, and one part of communicating without words is getting physically lower than the child because it preempts that threat response from the perception of a lack of equality. So when I talk to my son, I often sit on the ground if he's on the couch or on the bed. Well, with another mother who had a child similar age, internalized expression, she experimented with this, and the child was like, why are you sitting on the ground? Why are you below me? And was like having his own reaction to it. So what did I say to her? I didn't say, well, you need to do it more and you're not doing it right, or something's wrong with your child that it's not working, because that would have replicated what we've all experienced in the pediatrician or therapist office who's doubling down on a dogma. What I said is, okay, we have some data. We experimented, we have some data. Let's pivot. Let's try something else. Let's try a different accommodation. Okay, so it's hard to convey this level of nuance on Instagram because like tiles and reels don't afford this, but I need you guys to know this about me because I'm never going to tell you this is right and this is wrong. I'm here to guide you to make your own decisions and experiments so that you can learn your child. Okay? And then finally, I'm just going to share something from Buddhist psychology because again, I don't have a strong or fixed identity. I'm not like, I am a Buddhist. However, I use Buddhist practices. And from Buddhist psychology, the 25th principle is release opinions, free yourself from views, be open to mystery. Okay, so this is kind of like the second thing I said of being open to being wrong. I feel very strongly that allowing for some uncertainty and not holding so fixed to my identity or views allows me to bring non-judgment and compassion to all the different types of people who end up in my world. So I wanted to share that with you because as the account grows, I want people to understand the approach that I have here. Okay, with that in mind, it is Coffee with Casey and we have some time to answer questions. So I'm going to go back and look here for the questions. Welcome. Okay. What do you think about American Health denouncing PDA and doubling down on ODD? So I'm not sure I understand fully the question, but I don't know if that's like an organization or just the United States doubling down on ODD. I think that people like certainty and people like to feel confident, especially in the medical field, and all of us do. And so there's always going to be a preference for what has been vetted and what's in the DSM-5. However, as parents, that doesn't mean that we have to follow the prescriptions of behavioral approaches that go with ODD, even if our child has been diagnosed. We have that agency. Okay? So the thing about research is it takes a long time. I mean, we're talking years for good research to evolve, right? And like on the edge of new knowledge is always uncertainty. But a researcher is very different than a pediatrician or a therapist who is trained in a school with the existing research. So there's always going to be a lag between cutting edge knowledge, which you guys have because it's in your bedroom and your living room and your kitchen, and what trickles down and is vetted and sanctioned in institutional circles. And so it doesn't surprise me I don't think it's like a normative thing where people are bad. I think people are responding to incentives and structures that they operate within. And so if we can look at that objectively, hopefully it gives you more of a focus on your own agency within constraints, because ultimately I don't think that's going to change for like 5 to 10 years, but who knows? Again, I think the catalyst for change is parents stabilizing their home so that they can have the like frontal lobe capacity, getting out of burnout, seeing possibility, potential to then do amazing things with their life, which many of you were doing before your child reached burnout and or you reached burnout. So it's kind of like a grassroots perspective. Giftedness is a neurotype with all kinds of similar manifestations to all the other ones. Yeah, definitely. True, people, things can surprise you. Agreed. How can we help our child not go into panic when they hear no from another kid at school? So Tia, I'm going to save that one because you and I are corresponding personally, but I think if it weren't you asking, I would normally say like, you can't necessarily stop that because that is the nature of the disability, right? The no is a representation of someone being above the child, deciding that they're going to say yes or no, and a loss of autonomy and choice around playing. So like that is the exact root cause of what activates the nervous system. So generally when that is an outcome, it's a reflection of the disability and or cumulative nervous system stress. So I don't necessarily have a strategy to make that not true because that's the nature of how the brain works. But we can talk about all the ways we can mitigate by using accommodation so that she's not reaching her threshold in the moment. Do you think having a diagnosis of PDA profile would be beneficial? We are in California. Okay, so this is another example of like, I don't know. Because I don't know you. I don't know why you want a diagnosis. So like the things I would ask you would be, are you needing a diagnosis so that you feel confident and have permission to accommodate your child? Or are you interested in a diagnosis because you need to be able to advocate in a school and you need to be able to get insurance coverage with an autism diagnosis and you need to have access to things? And so that's the first thing I would ask, which is like, what's your root need? And if it's only permission to accommodate your child, you don't need it. And then we go through the cost benefits of your particular situation, which would include family system, finances, the cost of actually going through the process where your child is in burnout, recovery, equilibrium. And then I would support you in making a decision. So again, this is like, I teach parents how to think about making decisions that reflect their needs, not prescribing a like, you should do this, right? Because you're unique and your child is unique. And ultimately, like what I want for parents is to feel empowered to make their own decisions without looking to an external authority, including me, right? Because we're trying to get away from like a medical person above you being like, you have to do ABA, right? And if your mama heart is intuitively thinking, no, that's not correct, but you're being shamed into doing it, then we're at the root of what the issue is, right? So we're trying to unpack that and unravel that here. How to talk to teachers who believe tough love and high expectations is the way to teach children. My PDA kid masks at school so the teacher doesn't experience his meltdowns and pushes. Yeah, usually I encourage parents to start with specific requests, and I have some posts on nonviolent communication to do that. And then we experiment with communication and setting boundaries and advocacy, and then receive the data from those attempts and then make decisions based on that, because sometimes the data shows us that X person is not actually open to learning. And then we have to radically accept that, which is really painful. But that radical acceptance allows us to stop using our energy on trying to change or control others, like a teacher, and make decisions where we do have agency that allows us to move in a direction that's aligned for our family. How to encourage school when child refuses. Homeschool, reduced days, other schools aren't accessible right now. I don't want to traumatize, but we are stuck. Okay, again, so like I would try and get to the root of the problem with you, and I would want to understand your family system of like, okay, what are the constraints? Are you a single mom? Do you have a history of childhood trauma? So being in the home with your child, providing undivided attention or dealing with equalizing behavior is going to be too triggering for you. Is it because you're in a context geographically where you're not allowed to do homeschool? So we would work within the constraints to figure out your cost-benefit decision making. And I know you guys want like concrete answers of like how to do this, but I can provide tools that move you forward, which often include going to the root of what's actually going on. Because if I'm just like, use declarative language to encourage your kid, if the energy behind it is that you're using declarative language to get them to go, then they're going to perceive that and resist more, right? So like, why I go back to the fundamentals is like, I don't actually want you guys to just get stuck, right? And like, there's a lot of stuff on Instagram where it's just like, do this, right? And then you do it and you're like, why isn't it working? But it's not you, right? It's because it's complex and there's a lot going on. Yeah. Are you submitting your research? Oh, yes. Good update on the research. Thank you for asking. Okay, so we've gotten everything approved by the Institutional Review Board at the University of Michigan. The survey, sorry, my buzzer's going off. The survey is finished, and I just submitted materials for the flyer and marketing the survey to the university because it has to be approved in the same way that like I used to have to vet policy stuff, right? Like as someone on social media, I'm like, I want to say all these things about like participate in the research so that we can get PDA on the map. But the university doesn't allow you to say stuff like that because the outcome has not been produced with empirical data. So I'm going through this process of like going back to the academic brain of being like, okay, they're not going to approve my memes for marketing this survey. So anyways, as soon as it's coded by the university, which is in the process of being coded, and as soon as I get the materials for disseminating the survey through different outlets, then we're going to have the survey open for about a month. And then once we get the data, we will analyze it. And the University of Michigan has like a statistician and, it's gone through all of these vetting processes. So I'm super, super, super excited. The principal investigator is a tenured faculty member at the U of M Medical School, a neuropsychologist, and also a mom of a PDA child who took the Paradigm Shift program, and we connected. So it feels very cosmic, and I'm thrilled that it's finally coming to fruition. So stay tuned for that. It would be transformational for you guys to participate in that. Any parent who believes their child is PDA between the ages of 3 and 17. Yeah. Okay, I'm just checking my time because I'm going to yoga. Okay, I'm going to do one more. Yeah, Punk Pixels, thanks so much for responding to Cookie Blade. Yeah. Are you using your research to write and submit a peer-reviewed paper? Yes. Yes, we are. We're going to do that. I'm confused about masking. If PDA is a nervous system disability and their threat response is not in their control, how can they control the response through masking? Yes, this is an awesome question, and I have it written down to do a reel on, and I'm sorry I haven't yet. Okay, so there's two types of masking, I believe. There's what we hear about in the autistic space, which is like imitating neurotypical norms or social norms, or using scripts maybe that you've learned on YouTube, or observing other people in the environment in order to appear more neurotypical, right? And this can be a more conscious learned response, or there's some subconscious masking going on just because of the perception of what's safe or not. Then there's another, what I call masking for PDA kids, which is more like the internalization of the threat response, which means instead of fight flight coming out, which is one pathway for nervous system activation, the same part of the brain that's operating all the threat perception, which is the limbic system, the survival brain, is perceiving on a subconscious level, I'm not safe to go into fight or flight. Whether that's at school, around a grandparent, it's the same perception, subconscious perception, that like an antelope would have if they can't fight or flight the lion. Then they sort of collapse, shut down, go internal, and freeze, right? So that's another pathway for a nervous system response to perceived threat. So it actually, I believe, is happening on a subconscious level based on the same mechanisms that is causing the fight-flight behavior, but the same part of the survival brain is like, it's not safe to do that. Let's send the nervous system down the more freeze pathway. So that's what I believe is happening and why it can occur not under the conscious control of the child. And just anecdotally, like my son, I would see his face change. I would see his eyes change. It was like the moment he saw me, the mask would come off and he would start to go into fight or flight, right? So he's moving out of that freeze state that he was in during school, or even internalizing at his grandma's house, and it would immediately move back up through fight flight. And it wasn't a conscious decision. It was just like safety. So that is my answer to you, and now I'm going to go to yoga. Thank you for being here, everybody. Bye.